America likes to believe that every story eventually finds its ending, that every loss is counted, every name is written down, and every sacrifice is recorded somewhere in ink that does not fade. We grow up with the idea that when men are sent by their country into danger, the least that country can do is remember exactly what happened to them. But history does not always work that way. Sometimes stories do not end. They blur. Sometimes files do not close. They fracture. And sometimes a case does not stay buried because it was solved, but because it became easier to stop asking questions. Far in the north, beyond the places most Americans associate with World War II, there is a chain of islands where the wind never seems to rest, and the fog can erase the horizon in seconds. The Aleutian Islands are harsh, isolated, and unforgiving. Even today, they feel distant from the rest of the world. During the war, they felt even more so. And somewhere in that landscape, during a conflict that was supposed to be documented down to the smallest detail, an American patrol went missing in a way that has never been fully explained. This is not a story about a famous battle. It is not a story about medals or victory speeches. It is the story of a case that never found a clean ending. A story told in fragments and reports that do not agree with each other, in timelines that shift depending on who is speaking, and in a silence that grows heavier the more closely you examine the records. The Aleutian Islands stretch from Alaska toward Asia like a broken spine of rock and volcanic soil. The weather there is not just bad. It is unpredictable and often violent. Fog can roll in without warning. Winds can knock a man off his feet. Rain and sleet can turn the ground into something between mud and ice. Even experienced pilots and sailors feared the region, not because of the enemy, but because the environment itself seemed determined to destroy anything that stayed too long. When Japanese forces occupied parts of the Aleutian chain in 1942, the United States suddenly found itself fighting for territory that most Americans had never heard of. On maps, it looked like a distant edge of the war. In reality, it became a quiet, grinding struggle against both an enemy and a landscape that offered no mercy. Men were sent north into conditions they were not fully prepared for, tasked with holding ground, scouting positions, and keeping watch in a place where even simple movement could become dangerous. Official reports described these missions as routine, standard patrols, normal reconnaissance. But letters from soldiers stationed in the Aleutians tell a different story. They wrote about the cold that never really left their bodies, about the fog that made the world feel like it ended a few steps in front of them, and about the constant sense that if something went wrong out there, no one would know where to start looking. And then one patrol did not come back the way it was supposed to. At first there was no immediate panic. Delays were common. The weather could slow everything. Routes could change. Units could be forced to take long detours. But as time passed and no contact was made, concern began to grow. Radios stayed silent. No reliable sightings were reported. And when officers tried to reconstruct the patrol's last known movements, they realized they were working with information that was already uncertain. Search efforts were launched, but the Aleutians are not a place that preserves evidence. Rain, wind, and volcanic ash can erase tracks in hours. Fog can hide entire hillsides. Sound does not travel the way it should. Even large objects can seem to vanish if you do not know exactly where to look. And yet, despite these difficulties, the records suggest that something was found, or at least that something was reported as found. This is where the story begins to split. Some documents suggest that equipment linked to the patrol was discovered without the men. Other reports hint that the men themselves may have been located, but under circumstances that were never fully explained. In some versions of the story, the patrol is described as lost to the elements. In others, there are quiet references to possible contact with enemy forces. And in more than one case, the details simply do not match from one report to the next. Dates shift. Locations change. Descriptions become vague. One report will speak with confidence about where the patrol went. Another will describe a different route entirely. Some will treat the outcome as settled. Others will use language that suggests uncertainty long after the supposed conclusion. And once you start noticing these inconsistencies, it becomes impossible to ignore how often the story refuses to stay the same. This is where the case stops looking like a tragic but understandable wartime loss and starts looking like an investigation that was never fully resolved. Wars are chaotic, but they also generate paperwork, reports, logs, summaries, and official conclusions. In most cases, those records at least agree on the basic facts. In this case, they do not. If the patrol was simply lost to the environment, why do some documents suggest a different outcome? If the men were found, why are they still described in ways that imply uncertainty? And if the truth was known at the time, why does it seem to survive only in fragments, scattered across files that never fully align? For families, this kind of uncertainty is not just frustrating, it is devastating. A clear answer, even a painful one, is easier to live with than a story that keeps changing. Letters and notices can tell you that someone is gone, but they cannot explain how or why when the official versions keep shifting. And over time, that uncertainty becomes its own kind of wound. As the war moved on, the Aleutian campaign faded from public attention. It did not fit the heroic narrative that was being built elsewhere. It was cold, slow, and difficult to explain. Victories there were not dramatic. Losses there did not look noble in the way the public had come to expect. They looked like men disappearing into fog and not coming back. And so the paperwork was filed, the focus shifted, and this case quietly slipped into the background. But it did not disappear. Years later, historians and researchers began comparing sources. Families began asking questions again, and slowly a pattern started to emerge. There was not one story about what happened to that patrol. There were several, and none of them fit together cleanly. Some accounts framed the event as a simple tragedy. Others hinted at combat without ever clearly stating it. Others avoided specifics altogether. And in more than one place, key moments were described in ways that contradicted each other completely. That raises a difficult and uncomfortable question. Was this confusion the natural result of chaos and bad conditions? Or was it the result of something else? Something that made a clear explanation harder or less desirable to put on record? One theory argues that the patrol was simply overwhelmed by the environment. The Aleutians have claimed many lives without any help from an enemy. Exposure, exhaustion, and disorientation can turn small mistakes into fatal ones. In this version of events, the contradictions in the reports are the result of incomplete information and the passage of time. Men vanished into terrain that did not preserve evidence, and officers were left to write reports based on fragments and assumptions. But this explanation begins to feel less complete when you look closely at the language used in some of the documents. Certain phrases appear where clearer ones should exist. Words like believed, likely, and presumed replace statements of fact. In some places the reports seem careful, almost cautious, as if the writers were trying to describe something without fully committing to what they were saying. There are also quiet references that suggest the patrol may not have been alone in that landscape. The wording never says this directly. It never describes a battle, but it hints at movement, at contact, at events that do not fit neatly into the category of accident. And once those hints are noticed, they are difficult to ignore. Another theory suggests that the patrol encountered something it was not supposed to, and that the outcome was not as clean or as simple as later summaries made it seem. In wartime, not every incident becomes a headline, and not every mistake becomes a lesson printed in a manual. Some events are recorded in careful language, others are simplified, and some, especially those that raise uncomfortable questions, are quietly folded into more convenient explanations. This does not mean there was a deliberate cover-up in the way people often imagine such things. History is rarely that simple, but it does mean that there are moments when institutions choose clarity and moments when they choose stability, and sometimes stability wins. For the families, these distinctions do not matter. What matters is that the story they were given never fully settled. Over the years, different explanations surfaced. Some sounded confident, others sounded uncertain, and none of them managed to erase the others. The result was not closure, but a long, quiet uncertainty that stretched across decades. Imagine living with that. Imagine knowing that your son or brother was sent to a place few people could even point to on a map, and then discovering that the official story of what happened there keeps shifting depending on which document you read. There is no way to build peace on that kind of foundation. Researchers who later tried to reconstruct the patrol's final movements faced the same problem. The terrain had changed. The evidence was gone, and the records, instead of guiding them, often pulled them in different directions. One map would suggest one route. Another report would suggest something else. Weather data could explain some possibilities, but not all of them. Every answer seemed to open a new question. Some focused on the environment, arguing that the Aleutians themselves were the real enemy. Others focused on the documents, arguing that the story they tell is not the story of a simple accident, but the story of uncertainty being slowly turned into something that looks like an answer. And once you see it that way, the case begins to look less like history and more like an unresolved investigation. In most resolved cases, even tragic ones, the story becomes clearer with time. New details confirm old conclusions. Conflicts in the record are smoothed out. Here, the opposite seems to have happened. The longer you look, the less stable the story becomes. The contradictions do not disappear, they multiply. That does not prove anything by itself, but it does prove this. Whatever happened to that patrol was never reduced to a single unchallenged truth, and by the standards of any serious investigation, that means the case is not really closed. For historians, this means the case remains open in everything but name. For families, it means living with a story that never truly stops changing. And for anyone who believes that every sacrifice deserves to be clearly remembered, It leaves behind a quiet, persistent question. If this was truly understood at the time, why does it still read like an unfinished file? The Aleutian Islands are quiet today. The wind still moves the fog the same way it did decades ago. The ground still swallows sound. And somewhere in that silence is the outline of a story that was never fully told in one piece. Not because no one tried to write it down, but because no single version ever managed to survive without contradiction. This is not a tale of victory. This is not a tale of glory. This is the story of a case that never found a clean ending, and of how even in a war that was supposed to be documented and remembered, some truths can still disappear into the margins. And perhaps the most unsettling part is not what we do not know, but what the record suggests without ever saying out loud. That in a place where no one was really watching, an American story was lost. Not just in the fog, but in the files. Because if this case can remain this unclear, even after all these years, then it forces one final, uncomfortable thought. This may not be the only story like it, and that means some chapters of history are not closed. They are just quiet. But quiet does not mean finished. Somewhere in archives and old boxes, in folders that few people ever open, there are still pieces of this story waiting to be read together. And until they are, this will remain what it has always been, not a solved tragedy, not a closed file, but a question that refuses to disappear. A reminder that even in a war defined by records and reports, some truths can still slip through the cracks. And when they do, what is left behind is not just history. It is uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of lasting much longer than any war. There is one more layer to this case that rarely appears in summaries, and that is the institutional side of uncertainty. Military organizations are built on structure, on chains of command, on reports that move upward and decisions that move downward. In theory, this creates clarity. In practice, it sometimes creates distance. When an incident does not fit neatly into categories, it can be reshaped until it does, not necessarily out of malice, but out of necessity. In the Aleutians, necessity often meant simplification. The environment was blamed because the environment was always there. The fog was blamed because the fog never left. And in many cases that explanation was probably true. But the problem with relying on a single explanation is that it can quietly absorb every other possibility, even the ones that deserve to be examined more carefully. Some historians have pointed out that wartime records are not just descriptions of events, they are also reflections of priorities. What gets detailed? What gets summarized? What gets left vague? All of that tells a story of its own. In this case, the closer the documents get to the patrol's final moments, the less specific they become. That is not proof of anything on its own, but it is a pattern that invites questions. It also invites a harder conversation about memory and responsibility. If a story remains unresolved long enough, it slowly changes. It becomes less about what happened and more about how it is remembered. And when that happens, uncertainty can start to feel normal, even acceptable. The file stays open, but no one is really expected to close it anymore. For the families, that quiet acceptance is not comfort. It is absence. It is the feeling that something important was left unfinished and then slowly set aside. Time does not heal that kind of wound. It only makes it less visible to everyone else. And that may be the most human part of this entire case. Not the documents, not the theories, but the simple fact that for some people, this was never history. It was always present, always unresolved, always waiting for an answer that never fully arrived. When you step back and look at the Aleutian Patrol case as a whole, what becomes clear is not a conclusion, but a pattern. The environment explains some things. The records explain others. The theories try to connect the rest. But none of them manage to replace uncertainty with something solid. Instead, they form a kind of unstable structure, where each answer depends on assumptions that were never fully tested. And that is where this case begins to change. Because at this point, the question is no longer only what happened out there. The question becomes how the story of what happened was built, who shaped it, and why certain versions survived, while others quietly disappeared from the record. In many investigations, this is the moment when attention shifts from the event itself to the way it was documented, to the reports that were written under pressure, to the summaries that were passed along and slowly turned into official history, and to the small choices in language that can transform uncertainty into something that looks like a fact. If the Aleutian Patrol had truly been understood at the time, the story would have grown clearer with each passing year. Details would have been confirmed. Contradictions would have been resolved. But that is not what happened here. Instead, the record became more fragmented, not less. And that fragmentation is not an ending. It is a signal. It suggests that the real mystery may not be hidden only in the fog or in the terrain, but in the way this case was processed, summarized, and remembered. And once you start looking at it from that angle, the Patrol, as disappearance, stops being just a wartime tragedy and starts to look like something closer to an unfinished investigation, which means the most important questions are still ahead. To understand why this case never settled into a single version, it helps to look more closely at how information moved during the Aleutian campaign. Reports did not travel instantly. Messages were delayed by weather, by distance, by equipment failures. Officers often had to write summaries based on partial information, and those summaries became the foundation for later conclusions. Once something was written down, it tended to be repeated, even if it was incomplete or uncertain. This is how small uncertainties can become permanent features of a story. A location written incorrectly once can be copied again and again. A time recorded as an estimate can slowly turn into a fixed point, and a conclusion reached under pressure can become official history simply because nothing ever comes along to replace it. In the case of the Lost Patrol, this process seems to have happened more than once. Early reports tried to impose order on a confusing situation. Later reports relied on those early summaries. And over time, the distance between what was known and what was written down became harder and harder to see. This does not require a conspiracy. It only requires time, repetition, and the human need for closure. In a war filled with urgent problems, an unresolved case in a remote place can slowly turn into a footnote, and then into something even smaller. Not because it does not matter, but because there is always something louder demanding attention. But when you go back and read the documents carefully, you can still see the cracks. You can see where certainty fades into assumption. You can see where language becomes careful instead of direct. And once you start noticing those moments, it becomes clear that the story was never as solid as it was supposed to be. Another way to approach this case is to look at it the way investigators look at modern cold cases, not by asking what explanation is most convenient, but by asking what explanation survives the most questions. In that sense, the Aleutian Patrol remains deeply unsatisfying, because every version of events leaves something important unanswered. If the environment was the sole cause, then why do some records hint at other factors? If there was contact with enemy forces, then why is that never clearly stated? And if the truth was known at the time, why does it still feel so fragmented decades later? In cold case work, patterns matter. So do inconsistencies. A single contradiction can be a mistake. Many contradictions pointing in different directions usually mean the story was never fully understood in the first place. And that is exactly what makes this case so difficult to leave behind. Each time researchers try to simplify it, they run into another detail that refuses to fit. Each time they try to close it, they find another reason to hesitate. The result is not a neat conclusion, but a kind of historical stalemate where uncertainty becomes the only consistent element. And that stalemate is not an ending. It is the middle of the story. When investigators look at old military cases, one of the first things they study is not the event itself, but the paper trail around it. Who wrote the first report? Under what conditions? With what information? And, just as important, what that person did not know at the time. In the Aleutian case, those early reports carry enormous weight because so many later summaries depend on them. The problem is that those first documents were created in a situation defined by distance, bad weather, and limited communication. Officers were not working with a complete picture. They were working with fragments. A radio message here, a delayed update there, a map that might already have been outdated by the time it arrived. From that material, they had to build something that looked like a coherent story. Once that story existed on paper, it began to harden, not because it was perfect, but because it was all that was available. Later writers did not start from scratch. They copied, rephrased, and summarized what was already there. And each time that happened, the gaps became less visible, even though they were still there. This is how uncertainty can slowly turn into something that looks like certainty, not through discovery, but through repetition. And in this case, repetition may have done more to shape the official narrative than any single piece of evidence ever did. Another issue is that the Aleutian campaign itself was never a priority in the way other parts of the war were. Resources were limited. Attention was focused elsewhere. And that matters because investigations need time, people, and pressure from above to stay alive. Without those things, even serious questions can fade into administrative routine. In practical terms, that means the disappearance of one patrol in one of the most remote theaters of the war was competing with events that seemed far more urgent and far more visible. Entire battles were unfolding in Europe and the Pacific. Compared to that, the slow, confusing loss of a small unit in the far north was easy to push aside. But being small does not mean being simple, and being remote does not mean being unimportant. It only means that fewer people are watching closely, and when fewer people are watching, the record has more room to become vague, more room to stay unresolved, and more room to quietly accept uncertainty as an answer. That does not mean anyone made a single, clear decision to stop looking. More often, cases like this fade through a series of small choices. a report that does not get updated, a question that does not get reopened, a file that stays where it is because no one is told to move it. And over time, that is how an investigation turns into a story, and a story turns into a mystery. When you line up the available documents, one detail becomes especially telling. The closer they get to the patrol's last known position, the less precise they become. Distances turn into estimates, times turn into ranges, movements turn into possibilities instead of statements. This is not unusual in the middle of a war, but it is unusual for that uncertainty to remain frozen in place for decades without ever being resolved. In other cases, later investigations usually tighten the story. They replace guesses with measurements. They replace assumptions with confirmations. Here, the opposite seems to have happened. The early uncertainty stayed, and later summaries learned to live with it instead of challenging it. That does not mean the early officers were careless. It means they were working with limits that were never fully overcome. Some historians believe that this is the key to understanding why the case still feels unfinished. The first version of the story was written when too much was still unknown. Every version after that depended on it. And once a narrative reaches that stage, changing it requires more than curiosity. It requires institutional effort, and that effort was never truly applied here. There is also the question of geography, which in the Aleutians is never a small detail. Maps from that period were not as reliable as we might imagine today. Some areas were poorly surveyed. Some features were misnamed or misplaced. And in a region where visibility can vanish in minutes, even a small cartographic error can turn into a major problem. If a patrol was believed to be in one valley when it was actually in another, search efforts could have passed within miles without ever knowing it. And if that initial mistake made its way into official reports, it could shape every decision that followed. This does not create drama. It creates quiet failure, the kind that is only noticed when it is far too late to correct it. Later reviews of the campaign hint at exactly this kind of problem. They speak carefully about navigation difficulties and about how the environment itself resisted precise control. But they rarely connect those issues directly to the fate of specific units. Instead, they remain in the background as context rather than as possible causes. And that separation matters because it allows the story of the patrol to remain abstract, detached from the practical mistakes that might explain it. Another element that complicates this case is how silence works inside large organizations. Silence is not always in order. Often it is simply what remains when attention moves elsewhere. Files stop being updated, questions stop being forwarded, and what was once a problem to be solved becomes a situation to be managed. In the Aleutian campaign, management often meant accepting uncertainty as a permanent condition. Weather reports were uncertain. Supply routes were uncertain. Even basic movement was uncertain. In that environment, the disappearance of a patrol could be absorbed into a much larger pattern of things that were simply hard to control. And once that happens, the urgency to explain every detail begins to fade. This does not make the loss smaller. It makes it quieter. And quiet losses are often the ones that remain unresolved the longest. Over time, this kind of silence can start to look like an answer, not because it explains anything, but because it removes the pressure to keep asking. The file stays where it is. the summary remains the same, and the absence of new information slowly becomes normal. From a modern perspective, this is one of the most troubling aspects of the story. Today, unresolved cases are often reopened precisely because silence is no longer acceptable. New methods, new questions, and new expectations push old investigations back into the light. But in the years after the war, that culture barely existed. The priority was not to reopen old uncertainties. It was to move forward, to rebuild, to focus on what came next. And in that process, many smaller Messier stories were left behind, not because they did not matter, but because they did not fit the direction everything else was going. The Lost Patrol became one of those stories, present in the archives, absent from the conversation, known but not discussed. And that is a dangerous place for any unresolved case to live, because it allows uncertainty to survive without being challenged. When historians later returned to these files, they were not just looking for facts. They were looking for moments where the story could have taken a different path, moments where a question could have been asked more loudly, or where a decision could have led to a deeper investigation instead of a quiet conclusion. One of the most revealing exercises historians have done with this case is to place it next to others from the same period, not to compare tragedies, but to compare how they were documented. In many incidents, even when the outcome was grim, the paper trail becomes clearer over time. New reports correct old ones. Mistakes are acknowledged. Timelines become more precise. The story tightens. With the Aleutian Patrol, that tightening never really happened. The core uncertainties stayed where they were. The same vague phrases kept appearing. The same gaps remained open. And that suggests that the problem was not only the environment or the enemy, but the way the case itself was processed and then quietly accepted as good enough. There is also the question of scale. In a global war, individual stories can be overwhelmed by the sheer number of events. Losses become statistics. Incidents become lines in reports. And once that happens, the pressure to fully understand each one begins to fade. What matters is that the system keeps moving, not that every story reaches a perfect conclusion. But history is not only built from systems, it is built from people. And for the people connected to this patrol, the lack of a clear answer was not an abstract problem. It was a daily reality, a reminder that something essential had been lost, and that no official wording could replace it. This is why the case still feels unsettled. Not because there is one dramatic secret waiting to be revealed, but because the process that should have turned uncertainty into understanding never fully did its job. When all of this is taken together, the disappearance of the Aleutian Patrol stops looking like a single moment in time and starts to look like a long, unfinished process. A process where early confusion hardened into official language, where distance and difficulty discouraged deeper questions, and where silence slowly took the place of answers. The islands are still there. The weather is still unforgiving. The fog still hides more than it reveals. But what truly remains hidden is not just what happened to those men. It is why their story was never given the clarity that so many other stories eventually received. This is not a case defined by what we know. It is defined by what never became certain. And that uncertainty is not an accident. It is the result of how the story was recorded, summarized, and then allowed to rest without being fully understood. For some, this will always be just a footnote in a distant campaign. For others, it will remain a reminder that not every sacrifice is neatly explained, and not every loss is properly accounted for. And perhaps that is the most honest way to remember it. Not as a solved mystery, not as a closed file, but as a chapter of history that never truly reached its ending. Because sometimes the most unsettling stories are not the ones with shocking answers. They are the ones that leave us with questions that never completely go away. This case is over, but the truth is not. The next story is already waiting, and it's darker than you think. Stay with NightCase Chronicle. I'll see you in the next case.